Welcome to our channel Scary Sagas, where we bring you the most amazing true horror stories. Today, we have bone-chilling stories that will make your blood run cold. These stories are based on real events and have been passed down among the people. Are you ready to hear the ghastly ghosts and demonic spirits that still roam the deserted halls and corridors? Growing up, our family farm was adjacent to the grounds of an ancient jail that had been abandoned and was now unoccupied. I was told as a youngster not to go near that portion of our land, and Dad even erected a high wall to keep it out. I wasn't interested, and because our farm had 22 acres with much to see and do, it wasn't a huge concern to me. It was a nightmare I experienced when I was 14 on a cold winter night that sparked my interest. In my dream, a terrifying monster followed me through a dark passage, like an Egyptian mummy. The eyeballs peering out from the palms of his outstretched hands startled me more than his muffled wailing. As I awoke, I had a great attraction mixed with terror that something had to do with the prison. When I decided to go check it out, it had been snowing and there were at least 5 inches of snow on the ground. I sneaked along the wall until I came to a stile, then climbed over and landed on the jail grounds. I immediately felt as though I were walking into a lifeless zone. The mood was so strange that I thought I was in another realm or, at the very least, a parallel universe. I saw the towering, rusting wire fencing as I strolled across the field, which quickly turned into an asphalt compound. It didn't take long for me to discover a gap in the fence and make my way to the back of the building. I had to try numerous doors before finding one that was unlocked, but I paused as my panic grew. The handle was frozen, but I chalked it up to the fact that it was in the single digits outside and snowing. I was able to unlock it after a few tugs. When I looked inside, I saw the gloomy interior and the strewn floors. After a few cautious steps, I was stunned by the paint that was hanging off the walls and ceiling in strips and trailing on the floor. As I walked around the vast structure and halls, I saw a few overturned chairs and tables here and there. I realized I'd been silly to come when I heard the sound of metal doors banging and slamming shut. The problem was that I couldn't remember where I'd come in. So as I tried to retrace my steps, I heard a disturbing and familiar wailing. I didn't begin running until I heard quick shuffling on the floor. As I turned around, there was nothing there, so I turned around and ran again, just in case. The groaning became louder as numerous doors opened and slammed in the distance, so I dashed for the entrance. I discovered it was jammed, and I wasn't even sure if it was the door I used to enter, so I dashed off to locate another. I couldn't breathe because of the mounting terror, and I yelled as I heard shuffling behind me, growing closer. I was upset when I spun around to see what it was and saw nothing, so I screamed, "Who's there? What is your name?" I was enraged even more when the building fell silent so hushed that it nearly hurt my little ears. I yelled again as I turned around and stomped away when I noticed a huge piece of wallpaper unravel from the wall. Now that I was moving quicker, I tried every door and window I came across, but they were jammed and refused to budge. Dry paint began to fall from the ceiling all around me. I was now racing blindly since it was so dark. I toppled over the chair and struck my head on the floor because I didn't notice it. I was astonished for a long time before I sat up. I didn't notice the shuffling phantom approaching me. I could hear the groaning increasing louder and louder as the shuffle slowed. Then I noticed the bandaged feet. They were standing just in front of me. I realized I was gazing at the man from my nightmare as I glanced up. I felt the chair on my back smashing into the wall behind me as I scrambled backward. While I tried to flee, the creature rushed towards me, but I didn't want to get up in case he caught me. I struggled to roll left and right, panting for air, trying to crawl to a position where I could get up and run. The trouble was that the creature kept getting in my way, moaning loudly and waving his hands. I could see his palms' eyes flashing at me as they waved past my face. I started crying, feeling powerless and forlorn. He knelt in front of me, put out his hands, and held his palms up, his eyes close to mine. When his palms grasped my face, I noticed his black mouth moving behind the bandages, opening up and groaning loudly, crying in dread. I felt the monster's eyes fuse with mine in an unholy, visual union, generating a type of second sight through which I was able to view the monster's reality and was astonished to find myself seeing his own life flash before my eyes. There was a young man who was mute and was regarded as mentally defective and dangerous by the community. He was wrongfully accused of a crime he did not commit and then imprisoned, sometimes humiliated and tormented by the wardens. The individual was confined in solitary confinement for extended periods of time, and the abuse caused him to lose his mind. He was extraordinarily clever despite being silent, but the craziness gradually corrupted him and drove him insane. He died of exposure after decades of abuse and neglect when he was wrapped up and left for dead. Several of the convicts stated the sadistic wardens binding him to bed linens and throwing him down a well. I recalled seeing a well when I passed through the field on my way to the property. But then I noticed another flash. I could see the man attempting to unravel the blankets and tearing them as he attempted to crawl out. His idea suddenly entered my mind, saying, "Experience what I see. Look at how I feel. Assure them I'm okay, I'm fine." I yelled, "Who are you?" as I sobbed for him and myself. "I don't recall," he admitted. "How can I tell them if I don't know who you are?" I wondered. As the shuffling began, I heard groaning and wailing. I was standing next to the chair when I noticed him shuffle away from me, still moaning and weeping. "Please tell me," I shouted. "I can assist you." Suddenly he vanished. As an adjacent door unexpectedly opened, I leaped. It took me a while to decide to go since I debated going to attempt to find him but then decided against it. I hurriedly left and returned home, where I attempted to conduct research through a variety of channels with little success. When I informed my parents, they believed it was all a dream and grounded me for a month. But I'll never forget him. When my kid was 6 years old, we went shopping for bunk beds so he could have sleepovers with his friends. We weren't in a great financial condition at the time, so I was overjoyed when I found one used. It was at an inexpensive antique store an hour away from home, and it was just what we were looking for. We liked how it was handcrafted, strong, and lacquered wood. It was clear that it had been carefully cared for. We had never introduced my son to ghost stories before, which was what made this story so terrifying. I'll call my son Stephen to preserve his privacy. On the first day, he was overjoyed when we made the bed. He was afraid to sleep on the roof, so he grabbed his teddy bear and favorite race vehicle to accompany him to bed. Before washing the dishes and retiring to bed, I read him his favorite story and kissed him goodbye. I heard Stephen scream at the top of his lungs shortly after midnight. I dashed inside his room as quickly as I could. My son was as white as a sheet and trembling. I turned on the light and saw him screaming and pointing to the bunk bed on the other side of the room. I rushed over to him and picked him up, then returned to the bed. But there was nothing wrong. "What happened, sweetie?" I kissed Stephen. He shook his head and looked up at me, tears in his eyes. "The girl with the jumpy face," he eventually said in hushed tones. I urged him for further information, but he refused. We let him sleep with us that night, but we coaxed him into sleeping in his bed with the lights turned on the next night. Stephen yelled and called for us again, just after midnight. We both stood up and headed downstairs to his room. My spouse put his hand out to stop me before we arrived. My blood froze as Stephen continued to scream. A tiny girl was squatting down in front of Stephen's locked door as if she was about to spring at us. Her hair was matted and her skin was filthy. But the most alarming aspect about her was her zigzagging features. Her expression was like a supercharged earthquake. The odd rattling sound emanating from her neck was even creepier. Get the hell away from him, shouted my husband. She hissed, spun around, and leaped through the locked door. She vanished like a ghost going through walls, as my husband hurried to the door and tried to unlock it. When Stephen yelled, "Mother, Daddy, she's coming to grab me," he pushed and battled with the door. My instincts kicked in as I hurried to my spouse and assisted him in breaking through the door. As we walked in, the disgusting girl was trying to push her unclean fist into Stephen's mouth. When she turned to face us, her face began to spin into a million various expressions, and I shouted. She hissed, spun around, and leaped through the locked door. She vanished like a ghost going through walls, as my husband hurried to the door and tried to unlock. The awful shriek from within her made my skin crawl, but we charged at her to remove her from our board. She vanished as soon as we arrived. Stephen had wet his trousers while clutching his teddy to his mouth. The awful rattling and chatter in her throat could still be heard, but she was nowhere to be found. We made a bonfire and torched the beds that night. We heard a loud, awful yowl as we watched the flames, but the jumpy visage of Ghost Girl no longer plagued us. My husband and I spent our honeymoon in a rural fishing hamlet, renting a charming home for seclusion. While Mark is an ardent fisherman, I like to read or write while he pursues his hobby. We unloaded and built a fire in anticipation of a lovely wedding night. When a rainstorm approached, we decided to cuddle in front of the fire and tell ghost stories. Later, as Mark slept quietly, I tossed and turned, suffering from severe anxiety. I got up and walked down to the kitchen to make a relaxing cup of peppermint tea without disturbing him. I was sipping my tea when I heard someone tapping on the glass door. I initially assumed it was a limb from one of the trees. It barely took a minute for me to discover the tapping was coming from what I mistook for human knuckles. I moved carefully to the door, spilling my tea as a burst of lightning illuminated the patio, showing a person at the door. When I saw her terrible face, I yelled. As the lightning continued to strike, I noticed a wild-haired girl with her palms on the glass, staring at me closely. "What do you want?" I shouted, seeing her wild, curly hair flail around in the wind while she concentrated on me. When her mouth expanded into an ugly grin, chills rushed down my spine. Then she slapped her fists on the glass. I ran up the stairs and roused Mark up, begging him to accompany me downstairs to confront the woman. For getting to the door, he ran down before of me and protectively extended his hand out to keep me back. I saw she had vanished when I peeked over his shoulder. He turned on the lights and took out a flashlight. He told me to remain where I was while he searched the property. I stood there shivering in anxiety, waiting for him to return. He was irritated with me when he returned inside, all wet. "There isn't anything out there." I attempted to explain that I hadn't hallucinated the woman, but he persuaded me to return to his bed. He was soon snoring, and I continued to lie there in a state of panic as the storm wore on. When the tapping resumed, I began to fall asleep. I didn't want to annoy Mark, so I didn't wake him. I stood up and crept down the stairs. When I got to the bottom, I looked around the corner at the door. I could still hear the tapping, but she was nowhere to be found. I crept closer to the door, perplexed as to where she was. I couldn't believe my eyes as I turned around to turn on the lights. She was inside the home, staring at me. I shouted and backed up against the door, scared at the tapping on the glass as she stomped towards me. The lightning continued to flare as her hair blew about her face, blown up by the wind that was now blowing inside. She was very wet, and her ugly eyes were menacingly glaring at me. Her mouth extended into another nasty grin. I slipped down the door, terrified to scream again, and began shivering violently as her lips opened wide. I was terrified to find she didn't have any. Her mouth was like a deep, black pit into which I was drawn. When the woman closed in and bent over me, a dreadful screech filled the air, like a demonic vortex. I assumed I would be absorbed by her mouth. I felt as if I were spiraling higher till the lights turned on. When I opened my eyes, I noticed Mark peering down. The scary, ghostly woman had vanished, but I can still feel the dreadful vortex waiting for me. I've always had a profound passion for nature and the outdoors. So when we moved to the country, I was overjoyed. My husband, Ron, had inherited the land when his grandma died a few months before. The land included more than 10 acres, at least 3 of which were covered in deep brush and impenetrable forest. We were perplexed when his parents denied our invitation to the housewarming celebration, claiming they were ill. Ron had talked to them over the phone for 5 minutes before inviting them, and they seemed fine. Everyone else was excited to come. So we cleaned up and prepared for the celebration for many days. That is, until they appeared. Everyone's friends and relatives said they felt uncomfortable when they came. My brother brought a medium friend with him, and she was really anxious as they entered. I drew her aside to inquire what she'd said after she murmured something. But she was quite anxious and shivering severely. "This land is cursed," said the psychic. I was taken aback when she recommended both of us sell the house and accept whatever price was given. She asked my brother to take her home, and they were quickly followed by our other guests, who were all terrified. Ron and I stood in the kitchen, staring at the food and giggling at the medium's ridiculous assertion. We'd never sensed anything scary before, and we questioned if it was all a ruse to get us to sell for a low price. The hair on my neck didn't spike up until 2 days later when I was taking our 2 corgis for a stroll. I was astonished when both dogs began snarling before sprinting back to the house, leaving me alone. Even though I was shivering with terror, something prompted me to keep going. Suddenly I noticed a headstone hidden among shrubs. I brushed back the branches and leaves to expose an ornate gravestone with a pentagram above the name. I'll keep the name a secret for the purpose of privacy and a strong sense of anxiety, as we still reside on the land. We remain for a good purpose, which I'll explain later. What followed still gives me the shivers. When I rose up to recover the gravestone, I had a distinct impression that I was being watched. Turning slowly, I was startled to find a hunched person several feet distant, staring at me closely. It appeared to be an elderly woman dressed all in black, complete with a fedora hat, a long coat, and a wool shawl. I found it strange that she was dressed for winter, given that we were in the midst of a summer heat wave in August. Typically, I greet her and inquire if she was lost, but this was not a regular lady or scenario. She shouted fiercely a statement in a foreign tongue, then turned back and dashed into the forest. Despite my desire to follow her, I returned home quickly and chose to keep the encounter to myself. Ron detected a problem. So I claimed to be ill, retiring to bed early and falling into a dreamless slumber. As he went out to cut wood the next morning, I contacted my mother-in-law to see if she knew anything. She was apprehensive at first, but I quickly got her chatting. I discovered that I wasn't the only one who had observed the elderly lady. She informed me that the elderly lady was a witch. The witch had apparently resided on the land for decades before Ron's ancestors acquired it. It occurred to me that the witch had died and that I had discovered her tomb the day before. Ron's mother went on to add that because the land was cursed, she had never grown up happy on it. As I pressed her for additional information, she abruptly shut down and told me that I needed to contact a priest. Then I recalled the psychic, so I contacted my brother, but he claimed she refused to work with him. Even a thorough online search gave no results, so I tried to forget about it until I saw her again. Later that evening, while doing the laundry, I saw something outside, under the oak tree. The dogs were howling and snarling, but they refused to accompany me outdoors, so I walked alone. Ron was dozing in his armchair, and despite my fears, I was courageous enough to explore on my own. I approached the oak tree, screaming, "Who's there?" while holding the broom. Beyond the tree, I noticed a shadow. As I sped around, I collided with a woman, who appeared to be flesh and blood rather than a ghost, or so I thought. Her gleaming, black eyes peered out from behind the brim of her hat, and she shouted so loudly that I thought I was going to die. Suddenly she took the broom from my grasp, tossed it into the bushes behind her, and shook her bony finger at me. "Please don't curse me," I pleaded, raising my hands defensively. Her eyes blazed crimson as she cackled. A piercing bolt of pain shot through my brain, far worse than any migraine I'd ever had before that night. I collapsed to the ground, writhing in anguish, oblivious to the fact that she was taking me away. I felt the bumps in the ground, as well as twigs and stones, and realized she was bringing me to the forest. Even though I was in excruciating pain, I yelled and tried to struggle and escape, but she was formidable. I begged her, but she wouldn't listen until she eventually came to a halt in front of her gravestone in the bushes. I had a feeling she was trying to take me to the underworld, so I kicked and struggled hard enough to get away. I rose up, and she seized my wrists while muttering an awful spell through her teeth. Were jagged, and her eyes were still flaming red, like embers in an infernal inferno. "Please, please, I didn't mean any damage," I begged. "What are you looking for?" She came to a halt and gazed closely. Several roots sprang from the earth, climbing up my ankles to my knees. I was now sobbing uncontrollably. "Forest is mine," she added in shaky English as she leaned forward. "You no longer visit here. Is yours." I recognized what had to be done as she pressed her bony finger into my breastbone. I angrily nodded. "All right, I promise." I meant it and kept my word. Also persuaded Ron to do the same, and he still does. The curse is like a coiled serpent waiting for anybody to step foot in the witch's woodland, ready to pull any trespasser into the underworld. When I was younger, my uncle purchased a farm in the country with the intention of cultivating crops. It was nearly 40 acres of lush green property, with the homestead out front where my uncle and his family resided. An unusual feature of the property was an abandoned farmhouse in the back, which my uncle had sealed off. When I was 12, I overheard the grown-ups discussing the farmhouse's history at a family gathering. The original owner had apparently slain his family and even the family pets. His wife was discovered hanging inside. Before the cops could arrive, he buried his children and dogs in the backyard before shooting himself on the patio. My uncle owned dairy cows, horses, and 2 cattle dogs that refused to come near the farmhouse. I overheard him telling my parents that there were no rats or insects in a 50-foot radius. My 11-year-old cousin and I were captivated by the stories and made a covert plan to explore the next day. We were both terrified, despite the fact that we both enjoyed sharing and listening to ghost stories. We had no idea what nightmare awaited us. Despite our parents' warnings to stay away, we sneaked away and pretended to see the horses. We were soon stepping over the stile and approaching the farmhouse after meandering about, taking our time. We'd been chatting and enjoying each other's company, but the towering structure had silenced us. A peculiar hazy fog had gathered about the farmhouse, and I had a strong sensation of dread. My cousin was bolder than me, and she ran ahead of me, calling over her shoulder, "Come on, chicken." I swallowed the lump in my throat and followed, dragging my feet and feeling the darkness wash over me. When we got closer, the silence made me shiver, and the shuttered windows hinted that evil was there. I came to a halt at the front stairs as my cousin dashed onto the porch. She turned and motioned for me to join her. "You go in first," I instructed. She rolled her eyes, reached for the doorknob, and snatched her hand away in terror. Despite my fear, I was irritated with her. "What's the matter?" I inquired. She twisted the knob with a shake of her head. Suddenly, I was right behind her, and we took a hesitant step in. The thick air gobbled us up when the door groaned loudly. We proceeded towards the stairs as the building fell silent. Due to our great terror, neither of us talked. We were startled when a dog barked like an echo, followed by a shot from what sounded like a void within a memory. A strange, creaking noise then distracted us, making our flesh crawl and the hairs on our necks tingle. "What is that?" my cousin said quietly, before turning to look back. Her eyes widened as she began to scream. When I turned to follow her gaze, I noticed a woman suspended from the dusty chandelier. We dashed upstairs to get away. We could not breathe because we were weeping and clutching at one another. Suddenly there were additional cries from one of the bedrooms. We witnessed a small boy and girl run out of the room, drenched in blood, and trembling hysterically. That was it. We dashed out the front door, past the hanging woman, and returned to my uncle's house. We didn't notify anyone for fear of repercussions. Dealing with rebellious tenants who don't pay the rent is one of the most challenging aspects of being a landlord. It's even more aggravating when they depart without notice, leaving a massive mess that will take hours to clean up. What occurred to me was significantly worse, more akin to one of those turbo ghost stories you read about. My property was in a respectable area and in good shape, so I was concerned when I discovered they departed. They'd been in the residence for nearly 8 months and had always paid their rent on schedule until they left. I went over to check after receiving a call from a neighbor who said they had heard unusual noises. The restaurant appeared okay from the outside, but as I stepped inside, I nearly puked. The dirt and odor were revolting. They appeared to have purposefully abandoned the location, but I had the impression that there was something more nefarious going on. I tried not to cry as I surveyed the wreckage, but then I heard a splashing sound from above. I knew I had to go upstairs, and even though the power was still on, I took my time getting there. At each stride, the weird sloshing noises became louder. I could hear groaning as I got closer to the top of the steps. I couldn't tell if the sound was human, air conditioning, plumbing, or even an animal. It wasn't any of those. While I didn't realize it at the time, I had a feeling I was going to come upon something out of this world. I continued going for some reason, even though I was shivering and shuddering and my legs were turning to jelly. The splashing and groaning stopped as soon as I put my hand on the bathroom doorknob. I pushed open the door. What occurred next was so bizarre that I thought I was in the middle of a nightmare. That was a lot worse. My eyes were diverted by the horrible dirt and mold that had taken over. So the light wavered. I didn't notice the lady looking over the bath's edge at first. Suddenly I noticed the dark holes where her eyes should have been. I could only stare as she slammed a wet palm over the edge and onto the floor, riveted to the place. Her long, black, unkempt hair clung to her twisted frame. Her skin was practically transparent, with red streaks. I'm not ashamed to admit that I wet myself without realizing it. As the other hand touched the floor, I leaped. Her gaze was fixed on me as she lifted herself up and over the tube's rim, while the groaning resumed. The reasonable part of me tried to interpret the situation as a drug addict trespassing on my land. That's why I said, tremblingly, "May I assist you?" As her face got more hideous, I regretted my comments. What happened next still amazes me. As the upper jaw extended backward, her face opened up like a flip-top garbage can. As she slithered toward me, she appeared to be turning inside out. I shouted, spun around, and dashed away. The cops then came. They assumed I was insane because they never located the slithering creature. I wish that was the case because it would have made it simpler to believe. I'm not sure how to describe it, but I've always been able to see strange things that most people can't. Growing up in my house, I was able to experience things that my sister and parents could not. When I knew no one else was home, I might sometimes see a shadow figure in the hallway, or I'd notice objects move, such as a saucepan or skillet that wasn't there, but no one else would notice. I'm not claiming to be clairvoyant or anything. I simply observe these behaviors when no one else does. My wife and I decided to do a trekking excursion to Lassen Peak about a year ago. Hiking in the woods is something I enjoy doing, though my wife typically does not. She rapidly becomes bored. Going fishing or camping is my notion of a good time. Her notion of a good time is to play on her laptop while sipping red wine. I persuaded her to take a couple of days off work and agree to go trekking with me. We opted to travel during the winter since I prefer the countryside during the colder months. I've been on several beautiful trails since moving to California a few years ago, but I've never gone to Lassen Peak. I read that the views from the summit were quite magnificent since you can see the places where it had previously erupted. We arrived at the path later in the afternoon. I assumed we could do it in 2 to 3 hours because it was just 5 miles long. I recall starting the route and having the uneasy sense that someone was monitoring us. I kept glancing around, expecting to see someone looking back at me. My wife asked me what I was doing after I performed it a few times. When I informed her I suspected someone was monitoring us, she dismissed my concerns as paranoia. My wife and I would pause around a couple of miles into the route to take in the surroundings. Looking around, I noticed a person gently stroll behind some trees and then vanish. I informed my wife, but she dismissed me as neurotic once more. The more we went on the route, the more I felt a presence following us. After a time, we were on the last mile and it was becoming dark. This is when I began to hear voices, or more accurately, whispers, coming from the woods. When I questioned my wife about them, she stated she couldn't hear anything. Just as the murmurs died away, I noticed a faceless person materialize just ahead of the route. He was faceless, with no eyes, nose, or mouth. He was immediately in front of us, but my wife stood there as if nothing was wrong. As I returned my gaze to the man, He had vanished. When I questioned my wife why she didn't seem concerned, she said that she hadn't seen anyone on the route. I know I saw something, and it wasn't just my mind running wild. I'm not sure what it was, but there was someone or something else on the route with us. They seem to like that these stories will leave you with more questions than answers. They are a reminder that sometimes the truth is much darker and more mysterious than we ever imagined. Join us next time on Scary Sagas for other spine-chilling true stories.